Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. I'm back today again for Inspired by Stamping, and I want to share with you my favorite technique today, which is masking, two different ways. So for my first card, I'm going to start out with this Hummingbird stamp set from Inspired by Stamping. This is a fabulous stamp set to mask off a scene. I will also be using this Inkadinkado masking paper. It is just a white paper that has a tacky back. It's just a little bit sticky. It's not a permanent stick at all. Once you peel up that blue backing paper, it's almost like a post-it note. Now, if you don't have the masking paper, I'm going to show you another way later on where you can mask off your images. Now, the first thing I want to do is create my mask. Again, I'm using this masking paper. You could also use post-it notes as well, but I really like this masking paper because I can continue to use it over and over again until it loses all of its stick. So it will be good for quite a few cards. So I'm creating a couple of masks for each one of the flowers that's in the stamp set, and then one mask for each of the bird. I just stamp it out with black dye ink on the white side of this paper, and then I use my fine detail scissors to fussy cut each one of these masks. Here you can see I have a nice little pile ready to go, and now I can start stamping out my scene. I will be watercoloring my scene, so I'm using Canson watercolor paper, and I have mine cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Now you can create whatever size panel you want, and you can also color it in however you want. So just use whatever paper corresponds with the coloring medium you want to use later on. I'm also using black dye ink, and this is a waterproof black dye ink because I will be doing watercolor. Use again whatever ink corresponds with your coloring medium of choice. So the first thing I did was lay out my stamp on my paper and decide about where I want it. Then I can ink up my stamp and stamp it down onto my paper. Now it is best to kind of plan out your scene beforehand. So if you want to stamp it out and not mask it off, that's probably the best way to do it. I'm so accustomed to creating scenes at this point, I can kind of do it in my head. But until you get to that point, it might be best just to quickly stamp it out onto a scrap piece of paper. Now I wanted to mask this bird off. The best way to keep the stick on the back of these masks is to use your tweezers to place these down. Now you can use your hands, of course, but I have found that that puts a lot of oil, dust, and debris onto the back of the mask, so they don't last as long whenever I use my fingers. So I try to use my tweezers whenever possible. Now I'm moving on to this flower. You want to start off with your stamps that you want in the very front. So I wanted the bird to be in front of the flower, so I stamped the bird first and then moved on to that flower. Now I want to create a nice little array of flowers on the left hand side, so I'm going to stamp a few of these smaller of the same kind of flower, and I'm going to stamp one below the first flower and also on top. Now I didn't need to mask off that flower right as soon as I stamped it because it wasn't overlapping at all. So stamp as many as you can before you put down your mask, just to help move along the process. So I am moving back and forth between the larger flower and the smaller flower in the set just to create some different sizes here, and so it doesn't look as if I'm using the same flower across the entire card. And once I'm finished with this little bunch of flowers, I want to move on to stamping more birds. I wanted to make sure that I had room for my other two little birds on this card without cutting any little pieces of them off. So for my second little bird here, I wanted to make him look as if his little beak was in those flowers, but I wanted those behind the bird, so I couldn't stamp those first. So I'm using the mask as a placeholder just to make sure that I stamp it in the right spot. So once I know that, okay, I've got my bird exactly where I want it, I can move that mask out of the way and stamp my bird down. Then I wanted to make sure that I had room for this other little guy, so I'm also going to stamp him down. I want those birds to be the main focal point, and I don't want to do any stamping over them. So I don't want any flowers on top of them, so they need to be my first stamps. Then I can move on. I can mask those off. Again, I'm using my tweezers to place those down. and then I can move on and stamp the flowers so it looks as if the flowers are behind them. Now I want to make sure that the beaks of the birds look as if they are in the flowers. So the great thing about these stamps is they are clear stamps, so you can see right through them and know you're getting them in exactly the right position. Now I ran out of masks for my smaller flower, so I just picked up the one from the very bottom, knowing I didn't need that flower masked off anymore, and I can move it up to the top of the card where I need that mask right now. So you don't need 5 different masks for the flower. You can pick them up and move them around as you need them. And that is a great way to not have to cut out so many. Now I wanted to go ahead and stamp these other little flowers for this bird. And again, I already had the placeholder down, the mask as the placeholder, so I knew exactly where I wanted to stamp that flower. And I'm also going to stamp a few of these and spread them out a little bit so it looks as if they are in front of the other flowers that I'm going to stamp. And you want to make sure you do that. You don't want to stamp one directly in the center that's going to be the front and then continue to just go out and put the other mass behind it, which it looks a little odd when you do that. It doesn't look real. So make sure you spread out your flowers that are going to be in front. I put down my mask for those 2 flowers. Again, I used my tweezers, and you want to be a little careful because there are some fine parts on these flowers themselves. Then I went ahead and stamped another flower right in the center. I'll ink up my stamp again and stamp another one on the right hand side of this panel as well. Now there is a large white space in the bottom right hand corner. I'm going to be saving that for my sentiment, so I don't want any stamping there. Now the best part about this technique is taking off the mask and revealing your scene underneath. It's my favorite part. Again, I'm using my tweezers. I just pick up the mask and take it over to the back of the stamp set and just save my masks on there because I'll continue to use these until they completely lose their stick. Now you can see the scene coming together as I keep removing masks, and here the whole thing peeled up and you can really see the scene that is created underneath, and it's so easy to do just by masking off a few of your layers, putting a little bit of time into it, and you create this gorgeous scene from just one simple stamp set. I'll give you a little bit of a closer look here, and then I can move on to coloring this. Now, coloring can get a little bit tricky because you want to use colors that are cohesive and go together. Now, the best way that I have found to do this is to carry colors across your entire card. So I'll be using red and oranges on these flowers, and then I'll continue with that orange and then add a little bit yellow on the honeysuckle in the right hand corner and carry those colors across through my birds. Now I am watercoloring on my card panel here. You can use whatever coloring medium you might want to use. It will work, any coloring medium will work with coloring in your scenes. But I chose not to heat emboss. And because I chose not to heat emboss, I am having to work on different flowers that aren't touching at different times. So I have to do my watercolor in layers and sections. And if you want to avoid that, you might want to go ahead and heat emboss. I don't mind it because I wanted a nice flat scene. I didn't want any raised areas with my heat embossing. So that's just something that I have to deal with because I chose not to do that. Now with my hummingbirds, I'm going to let my watercolor do all the work for me and let it blend on its own to create some really nice blending between all the colors that you might find on a hummingbird. Now when you're doing realistic scenes like this, your best friend is going to be Google. And what I mean by that is look up your images, look up different pictures of hummingbirds, and go by the pictures you see on your screen. So I found a hummingbird with some greens and blues and browns, so I went with those colors for one of my birds. Then I also went with some reds and pinks and yellows and carried those colors across my card again on another bird. And the last little bird up in the left-hand corner, I kept really muted down with some browns and yellows just on him. I also added in some shading with my watercolor, and the last thing that really helped my card pop up off the paper is to add this blue sky around all of my images. I just did this with some tumbled glass distress marker, really watered that down, and just put a nice wash over my card. Now for the sentiment, I will be using this Thinking of You sentiment. It is from the Fresh Bouquet stamp set from Inspired by Stamping, and I'll be using that stamp set later on in the video a little bit more. I wanted this Thinking of You sentiment stamped right down in the right hand corner, so I used my black dye ink that I used for stamping my images before, and I also used my Misty. I didn't want to mess up my card front once I stamped down my sentiment. After I put all that work into the coloring, I wanted to get it right the first time. It also allowed me to double stamp because I'm working on watercolor paper. I wanted a nice rich black, and double stamping gives me that effect. Now I just put some double-sided adhesive on the back of this panel, and I can mount it onto an A2 white side folding card base. And this is just a card base that I made from white cardstock. If you have any overhang, like I do a little bit here, you can use your long blade scissors just to trim that off. This is going to give you the effect of a one-layer card, but it is a watercolor card without having the bulk of an actual watercolor card base. I also attached quite a bit of adhesive onto the back of this panel because I wanted it to lay nice and flat through the mail and not have any warping or anything that would go on as I put it through the mail. So a lot of adhesive on the back of your watercolored panels is always a plus. And that finishes off that card. Now for the second way that I like to do my masking. This, I'm not going to do any scenes. I'm just going to mask off this one stamp. But it is already, it looks as if it's a mask scene itself because it is many flowers into one bouquet. So I just want to mask this off and do some distress inking around it. Now if I don't have any masking paper on hand, if I run out and I'm waiting on an order, or for larger stamps like this, where I don't mind cutting them out each time, I will do this. I just stamp the image down onto computer paper, very thin typing computer paper, and then I trim this out with my fine detail scissors and fussy cut it just like I would any other mask. Now I need to stamp down my image onto my card panel. Again, I'm using a full A2 size panel here, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and this is plain white cardstock. This time I'm using Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I'll be using alcohol markers to color this in. So use whatever ink corresponds with your coloring medium. So I'll stamp this down, and you know Memento is not a very rich dark black ink, so I will do some double stamping, which is why I'm using my Misty. So I can just open this lid up, ink it up again, and stamp it right down in the same position as before. Now this video is already very long, so I did all of my coloring for this image off screen. I wanted a really vintage look, so I went with some creams and blues and purples for my hydrangea, some very dark green and some very chartreusey colors for the leaves, and then some peaches and pinks for the other flowers that are in this bouquet, and that really gives me the vintage look. Now I want to create like a vintage haze around my bouquet with the stress ink, but I need to mask off my image to do that. Now if you were to use this and use it with your masking paper, it would take up an entire sheet of masking paper. So what I like to do is I stamped it onto my computer paper and trimmed it out, and now I'm going to use rubber cement. This is the same stuff you find in the kids section at the craft store or your local grocery store. And I just use the brush that's in there, brush a very thin layer onto the back of this paper or the mask that I cut out, and then I can just place this down over the image while the glue is still wet. Now you want a very thin layer so none of it smushes out the side, and you want to place this down pretty carefully so none of your rubber cement gets anywhere else on the paper. Give that just a few minutes to dry. It does not take long at all, maybe a minute or two, and then I can start to put my distressing down over the top. The first one I'm starting out with is my antique linen, and I'm using my mini ink blending tool to put this down. I'm putting down quite a bit of this antique linen, and because I use that rubber cement to put this mask down, this mask is not going to move at all on me while I am really rubbing over this mask on the paper. So whereas my masking paper might have moved a little bit, this is stuck down until I peel it up. I also came back in just around the edges and where the mask comes in the most, and I put a little bit of vintage photo just to darken up those shadows. You can see I am using a piece of paper over my fingers to hold down this cardstock, and as you use more distress ink, it's going to build up color, and that will transfer onto your fingers, and then if you touch anywhere on that white cardstock, it's going to leave fingerprints. So just use a little extra piece of paper to hold that down while you're working. Once you're happy with your distress ink, I just peel up this mask. It comes off very easily, and it might tear a little bit, but that's okay. You can reuse these masks, but they're so simple to cut out and just apply some rubber cement on the back of again. I don't worry about saving these. I just peel this up. I'll discard this mask, and then it might leave a little bit of residue over your image. Just use a cloth or your finger, rub over that image, and all the residue will come right up and leave a nice clean masked image. I love combining distress ink and alcohol markers. I think it makes for more interest on a card. It also creates some really intense colors with your alcohol markers, and then some very fine colors, I guess you could say, some very subtle colors with your distress ink. So this is one of my favorite techniques to do and really combine the two coloring mediums. Now, I did not cut all the little pieces of my mask off, so in order to fix that, I use a Fantastics tool, dip it in my distress ink, and just fill in the white spaces that I might have missed with my distress ink the first time. Now again, I'm using my Misty to stamp down my sentiment onto my panel, and I am using that Thinking of You sentiment again. This time I have put the We've Been sentiments included in the set above the Thinking of You, and I'm stamping this down with my vintage photo distress ink. Now, I normally would not suggest stamping with your distress ink, however, it went along with my vintage theme, so I didn't need perfect stamping, and I was able to use my Misty and double stamp this, so I got some really rich, intense color, and it didn't beat up on me as bad when I used it this way. So I stamped that down into the bottom left-hand corner, and that finished off that card panel. The only thing left to do was attach it to an A2 top folding card base in this case with some double-sided adhesive. Now both of these cards that I created today are one-layer cards. However, because I put so much time and effort into masking out the scenes and then coloring in this bouquet and masking it off and really adding that distress ink around it for a nice effect, that they don't appear as very simple or just quickly thrown together cards. So this is a great way to really create those one-layer cards that you see and admire, but really make them look very put together and professional. I hope you all enjoyed this video tutorial, and I hope you'll give both masking techniques that I shared a try as well. In the description box below, you will find links to all of the Inspired by Stamping stamp sets that I used on today's cards. You can also find a link to their blog where you can check out the full picture tutorial and also the complete supply list. As always, thank you guys so much for watching today, and happy crafting!